Welcome to WorkSpan TV. I'm Allison Avalos, and I'm joined today by Don Lindner, Executive Compensation Practice Leader for WorldatWork. The SEC recently released proposed regulations requiring that companies report a CEO pay ratio. WorldatWork, in preparation for a comment letter, conducted a survey of its members who work in and around executive compensation. Don, will you first start off by explaining what the CEO pay ratio is?
A provision in the Dodd-Frank Act that was passed in 2010 requires public companies to calculate and publish a ratio of the CEO's total compensation versus the total compensation of the median employee. Median employee includes all employees at this point, which means full-time, part-time, seasonal employees. So on the surface, this would seem like a pretty straightforward, easy calculation. You take the CEO's total compensation that you get out of the proxy statement, you find the median employee and you get their total compensation, and then you divide the two and you get a ratio. But it's much more complex than it first appears, because if you have 150,000 employees, you have to find that median employee and then determine what their total compensation is. And if it's in a foreign country, there are different rules, there are different practices, and so first you have to determine it, and then you have to figure out exactly what their total compensation is. So it can be a much more onerous process than it first appears.
So what is the purpose of having the CEO pay ratio requirement?
Well, it's very interesting because in the Dodd-Frank Act, there was really never a stated purpose, nor is there in the proposed rules. The purported purpose is to provide additional information to investors so they can analyze and determine executive compensation for the various companies. But it really doesn't do that because the information that you need to determine the CEO's pay is already required disclosure in the proxy rules already that were updated in 2007 and 8, and further disclosure in, say, on pay. So it really doesn't add any new information or additional information to CEO pay for investors.
In the survey, we asked participants to estimate the cost impact of having to calculate the CEO pay ratio. What did we learn?
Well, it was very interesting. Because these are proposed rules, there's still a lot of uncertainty about what has to be included and not included. So over a third, 36% of the respondents weren't sure. They weren't sure what it would cost and probably not sure on how to calculate it. Another third thought it would be a fairly nominal cost between $0 and $25,000, although for a small company that may not be a small cost. And then the final third, it was estimated anywhere from $25,000 to in excess of $250,000 to be able to do this calculation of the CEO pay ratio.
You mentioned that non-U.S. employees as well as part-time, temporary, and seasonal workers in the proposed regulations would be required to be considered. If the regulations only required U.S. and/or full-time employees to be considered, what impact might that have?
In the results that we got back, we found that if you only include domestic U.S. employees, it can have a significant reduction in the cost of this calculation. Almost 30%, 29% of the respondents said that it would reduce the cost by over 40%. Another 20% said it would reduce the cost between 20 and 40%. So almost half the participants said you could reduce the cost significantly if you just include domestic employees. On the part-time, full-time, not near as a significant reduction. We only saw 6% of the respondents say that it would reduce it by 40% or more, and another 12% that would reduce it by 20% or more. So having just full-time doesn't have near the impact on cost as if we could keep it just to domestic employees.
WorldatWork has submitted our comment letter, as well as I'm sure many others. What is there for total rewards practitioners to do now? Do we sit and wait? Is there any action they can take right now?
Well, yes, absolutely. There are going to be final rules that are going to come out. We understand at this point, they may not come out until October. But anybody who is going to be responsible for making this calculation really has to start thinking about accessibility of data. As I mentioned before, doing the calculation is not that difficult. It's getting all of the data you need to determine that median employee and then determine the value of their total compensation. If I were a practitioner today, I would start looking at all the data I have available to me, determine if I'm going to be able to find all the data, and if not, starting to make plans on how I can solve that problem. That's about the only thing that they can do today until they get the final rules.
Thank you, Don. For WorkSpan TV, I'm Allison Avalos.
And I'm Don Lindner.